Welcome back, everyone. This is part two of the Housing Committee from February 2024 in Bedford. If you're coming across this and you haven't seen part one, it's not going to make any sense to you, so I recommend you to go back to part one, watch it, because we're just going to literally try and pick up where we left off a couple of weeks back when we recorded the first part. So I'm just literally going to continue as we were.
To do in that respect, and I understand the concerns from the member of the public earlier, and just wanted to give you my assurance that please don't. The intention is that report should not be interpreted in any way as saying that the council won't follow its lawful duties.
So I'm just going to chip in. There's actually been a bit of development since we recorded part one, and that is that there's been the most recent Housing Committee in June. So it was a couple of weeks ago, and they basically put through the recommendations, but they've taken out the bits that we were raising concerns about. So although here they're saying, we're not going to break this, doesn't mean we're going to break the law. It does look as though they've listened to what we said, because their actual recommendations going forward are legal. They're not, still, we'd probably argue that they're not ideal, but they are at least kind of make what they're getting these bits right with the law. So
the report clearly says that we are dealing with domestic abuse residents by putting them in temporary accommodation, which we personally think that's a good thing. What is meant by a prevention pathway for domestic abuse in reducing numbers? Because that concerns us in relation to how we're going to treat people that present as domestically abused.
So it's really important to say that if somebody approaches with domestic abuse as their reason of homelessness, that's an automatic priority need and would be treated as such. And so we would have a legal duty to place them in temporary accommodation for sure. What I would say is that if somebody approaches for assistance around domestic abuse early, and maybe that contact comes through children's services or through adult services, or it may be another provider or partner that they first engage with, because it's very difficult to come forward and express that you need help. It could be at that point that we can provide advice and signposting about alternative housing options or about how they can be safe in the tenancy they are. What we're dealing with at the moment is people approaching homeless at crisis point, and often there have been partners or involvement from other parts of the service over quite a long period of time leading up to that crisis point, and we might have prevented them needing to go into a hotel, which is never ideal and never. Temporary accommodation is an absolutely vital safety net, but I wouldn't wish it on anyone if it could be avoided. I think that's the point, that really, if we can support a family at a much earlier stage to make a managed move on into settled accommodation or to save their tenancy, that would be preferable than them coming to us in crisis and ending up in Travelodge.
Maybe this is my own bias, but the term crisis point, when we're talking about abuse, doesn't sit right with me. And I know I'm talking about like small language stuff here, and it feels like I'm being really pernickety. And actually, look, we went to the last housing committee, so I feel much more fondly of everyone in this video tonight than I did in part one. And they did make changes, but I just think crisis point, when you're talking about domestic abuse, that's not the legal term. The legal term isn't sort of anything to do with severity of domestic abuse. It's not down to the type of domestic abuse. It's down to that, is it likely to continue? So I guess if she'd use those sort of words instead, it made me feel uncomfortable, and I'm not sure if I can quite put my finger on it. It just seems a little off.
I agree with you. I'd argue that the way it should be dealt with legally, let's say you've got family known to children's services, there's domestic abuse involved, the individual says, a social worker, can you actually do something? Can you help me out with housing? That would, there's no need for it to develop into a crisis point, as you say, Shannon, to be legally homeless. That would trigger the homeless application, which then also includes the duty to provide advice, kind of legal advice, what can be got. And at that point, a housing officer or someone should come and potentially should then explain the rights that family have, which might be, you can make a homeless application, and yes, we have a duty to place you. This is what it would look like. It might be a hotel. Managed move might be might be possible. As that can be better for you. So you have that kind of conversation with the person where you told them their rights, you've given them time to digest it, and then they can make a decision about what they want to do. But I don't think that's kind of the kind of that strict kind of legal position. I don't think is really being I think is lost in that kind of that, as you say, that use of the word crisis. It's just it hides that that's not the as you say, that's not the point at which you step in.
And that personalised approach is what should be happening anyway. You know, with any sort of situation, whether it's domestic abuse or not, that personalised approach to what that person wants, needs, what have you, is legally owed, right? That should be happening anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was a bit sinister. And I don't think you're being picky, Shannon, because I picked up on that word crisis point as well. And it ties in with the question, is it Councillor Rowley, the one who asked the question?
And so Councillor Foley asked a question about domestic
sorry.
abuse earlier.
Yeah, because he was picking up on the term pathway to prevention. And you think, well, what is it they're trying to prevent? Is it domestic abuse in the first place? Now, that's a bit scary because it suggests that there's some sort of solution that you can provide which leaves the person in their accommodation so they don't need accommodation. And then there's the idea of it reaching crisis. I mean, how bad does it have to be? I mean, is she talking about, please don't come and apply on a Friday afternoon when we're just about to go home and we have to put you in a B&B, or can you give us a bit more warning? But it sounds, and people don't, I mean, that's what the nature of domestic abuse, isn't it? That people sort of encounter a crisis and they're trying to sort of persuade themselves it's not happening until then.
And you're exactly right. And everyone's crisis might look different. And I don't think we should be punishing survivors for their crisis being lower down the road than, you know, something more extreme. Like, it seems like a weird step when you think about the great steps that the Domestic Abuse Act has made.
You know, if you kind of follow that kind of legal stuff, so, you know, the person effectively makes an application to a department of the local authority. They then, as part of that application, get told, here's what happens, here's your options. They get told, legally speaking, that they can essentially decline to be dealt with as a homeless person at that point if they really understand what it is they're kind of making a decision on. But I think most people, like, unless it is kind of like, you know, really extreme stuff, they would rather have a little bit of time to get their head around, okay, kids' schools, my belongings, telling family, all of those kind of things. So they're often, I think there's absolutely going to be, you know, lots of situations where actually the council doesn't need to offer that assistance that same day. But the crucial thing is it's all about the consent of the client and you know, and I think, you know, given Bedford's track record, and I'm talking about, you know, Anna's predecessors, there were some disgusting, in my opinion, just disgusting people, like, you know, senior officers there. And, you know, they kind of, someone would make an application, they'd have a form which says, I choose not to make a homeless application. They say, oh, you know, it's a waste of time, just tick this box and sign it. So that person was then, you know, supposedly not making an application and kind of losing out on those rights when they didn't have any idea of it. So we kind of did a lot about that back in sort of 2016 about, you know, complaining about that sort of thing.
Thank you for the answer, because you've clarified, and this is not covered in the report that was commissioned, in that if somebody presents with domestic abuse, they have a priority need, so legally, the council should put them in temporary accommodation. So my question still stands is, how are we going to reduce the numbers so we're at the regional average when we have people presenting for domestic abuse and we have been putting them in temporary accommodation?
It's because at the moment we're not addressing the root causes or long-term demand flow. So what we're doing at the moment is dealing with people at crisis point, and that's our demand that's hitting the front door. And yes, we have a legal duty to pick up. But if we went upstream to look at the root causes, when that family is first encountering crisis, can children's services provide intervention and support at an earlier stage that might prevent them then reaching that homeless crisis point? So we're talking about long-term prevention pathways here, and it's not a quick fix. And so you won't see that sudden turnaround reduction in TA, but you might, over time, will develop a much more holistic approach to support families, which I think in the long term will reduce demand at the front door for TA. Yes.
Sorry, Councillor Croft, if I could just make the point that there isn't any legal requirement for the council to provide temporary accommodation when somebody is homeless. The requirement is to secure that suitable accommodation is available to that person, which it may seem quite a subtle difference, but for example, with domestic abuse, there may be other options. So it could be non-molestation orders, there's domestic violence prevention orders, and I think the point that Anna had made earlier is that ideally we'd want to work with victims of domestic abuse to minimise the need for them to actually leave the home. Of course, if somebody contacts us at the point where, you know, they have already had to flee their accommodation, then that is quite a different matter, and we would need to secure some form of accommodation. which realistically would normally mean providing temporary accommodation funded by the council.
Chair, could I just follow up on that point? So the report at the end says the following, which is not what our officers are saying today, because my understanding is that we want to work in partnership with those organisations that see domestic abuse at early stages, like children's services, like domestic abuse organisations out there in the charity sector. But the actual report says there should be a corporate task force led by the CEO, and this group should only be focused on delivering the reduction in temporary accommodation. It should not be subsumed into the proposed Bedford Borough Homelessness Reduction Board, which includes members of third sector parties and statutory bodies. So the report contradicts what officers are wanting to do.
Really glad he was there.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Councillor Weir.
Thank you, Chair. My final question, because some of the others were answered. The report highlights the fact that since March 2019 to June 2023, there's been an increase in 211% of temporary accommodation, compared to the rise of 24% for the rest of the East of England, or East of England as a whole. And I know that's quite a mind-numbing number, and I know there are many recommendations in the report to tackle this, and I'm pleased to see that staff are embracing that and moving forward with it. But is there a strategy in terms of how quickly all these recommendations can be employed? And I know they're dependent on when you get your IT system, but have you looked into the fairly near future to say by that date we will be in a better position?
I think it's very difficult because I don't want to set targets on the number I should have in TA at any given point. The reason I say that is because it's critical we place people when we have a statutory duty to do so, and that's not the way to manage targets across the team. So in terms of timelines and numbers, I can target how many preventions we're achieving, how many rehoused in a month, how many rehoused through social lets, and those are positive targets about customer outcomes, and that's what my focus is. We haven't yet got timelines around what those targets might look like from April going forward, but yeah, we can anticipate what we think our numbers might be.
I think that's a much better answer. So, and again, in the report, it was specifically putting a number on effectively how, I can't remember, it was something like you reduced the TA numbers by two households per week or something like that. So there was kind of a very, very definite target put on by the report, and yeah, refreshingly she's saying no, we can't do that because we've actually got duty to house people. So yeah, that was kind of, I think, a much better answer from her.
I've just got one comment on Councillor Weir's sort of question, I guess. And it seemed like he was reading it in a really negative light, that we've got an increase in TA of 211% compared to, the rest of the country at 24%. And we need to be in a better position. I would argue the fact that we've got a higher percentage of people in temporary accommodation is a bloody brilliant thing. And, he should be going, how do we get this number higher? Like, I just thought that was a weird way to word a question that I would have perhaps been a bit more positive about. But I really liked Anna's sort of answer here, and yeah, it was good.
What was lacking in Councillor Weir's, again, the report doesn't. First of all, the report only looks at the kind of very set things. So if you look at the total increase in the last 10 years, it's like 1,000%. So, so they're looking at very specific dates, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of understanding with Councillor Weir that councils across the region and across the country are breaking the law, and it's just Bedford breaking the law a lot less. So it's just that kind of, the report doesn't say that, and it doesn't appear that he's got any kind of concept of gatekeeping as a really widespread thing.
I'd love to have known, because he said like all my other questions have been asked or answered. I'd love to have known what those other questions were, because I can't, and maybe I'm doing Councillor Weir a disservice here, so I apologise, but I can't imagine it was, the questions that Councillor Cross was asking, for example.
Yeah.
But can I say, isn't Councillor Weir's contribution a bit scary in the sense that, or negative in a wider sense, that it follows on. Maybe you edited a bit so it wasn't straight afterwards, but there's talk of a task force that's out there to cut down the numbers of people in temporary accommodation. He starts off his question by saying, look how many people are getting temporary accommodation. How quickly is the task force going to do its business and get the numbers down again? And I'd have thought the interesting question he should have asked is, as you're alluding to, is what is the reason for this? What does this increase represent? Does it represent loads of people successfully trying it on who don't need temporary accommodation, which is one interpretation, or is the other that it represents a turnaround from previous gatekeeping? But we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. It would be interesting to see what Ms. Rabbani thinks.
Yeah, I wasn't for 1 minute thinking about targets in terms of people. I was thinking about when we have the IT systems in, when we have the right number of staff, when we have the right processes in place, and be humming along a Rolls Royce, really. And the numbers will be what the numbers will be.
Okay.
We have got an action plan that we're developing, and I think it's fair to say that we need to spend some time when we've decided which recommendations we're really running with, to Gantt chart that and plan over the next 6 months. Yeah. Councillor Crofts.
Thank you, Chair. We do have concerns about the consultancy report, and I think, just for clarification, because there has been some contradiction this evening, we can't use this report as like council policy. So we would like, I don't know whether we can make recommendations to the executive, but this report is going to the executive at the next meeting. And from that executive, could we have a council policy of what recommendations we're taking forward and what that means and what that looks like, rather than using this report as we are going to do this, yeah? Because there are things in the report, and I will quote, no household should be placed in TA unless clear evidence has been obtained that supports the claim that they have been excluded. Now, that's for people that may be estranged from their parents. It could be young people. So does that mean that if they can't prevent evidence, we're not going to give them TA? What happens? That's not included in the report, what happens on that example. The report also says no household should be placed in TA because it is not possible to complete a full and detailed assessment on the day an applicant presents. So if somebody can't produce evidence on that day, what are we going to do with that person apart from put them in TA if they're homeless? Because putting in somebody in TA, I don't think, is a bad thing. It means they've got a roof over their head. It means we haven't got rough sleepers. And we know, when we started the Everyone In policy, which was a government policy, we know that single people have multiple vulnerabilities and multiple needs. And it was a multi-agency approach that dealt with those vulnerabilities. And it's not as simple as just saying we have a housing officer that makes a decision on a vulnerable single person and says, no, you're not having any TA. Life is not that simple. And we know from the Everyone In approach, which is still a government policy is still to eradicate rough sleeping by 2030. We're going in the wrong direction. And that was one of the reasons we kept Everyone In at this council, to support people with vulnerabilities, because the legal bar for vulnerabilities is very high. And that's why our rough sleeping numbers have stayed at 2, not gone to 75. And we were an outlier, so I agree with Councillor Foley's point that we can't be compared with the regional average, because we've always had high rough sleeping in Bedford Borough, up until 2019 or up until the COVID pandemic, when the Everyone In policy came in. And that was funded by government, so we could do that. Yeah? So when you look at the money we spent on Everyone In, it's a tiny, tiny proportion of the money we're spending on TA. Because TA has other factors, problems, like Section 21 notices, and we are incentivising private landlords to issue Section 21 notices if we're going to say to a private landlord, come to us and we'll give you £3,500. Okay? Because they'll issue a Section 21, and then they'll come to us and we'll give them £3,500 and they've got a tenant. What happens to the tenant that they had? They're going to be dealt by our housing options team because they've got a Section 21. So that policy needs looking at. There's other concerns we've got about domestic abuse, but I just think we need clarity after the executive, and hopefully a report can be come to this committee later on to say, what is the council's policy now we've had this report? And what are we going to take forward? There are good things in there, like looking at the allocation of TA in terms of 40% and increasing that. Good luck with your conversations on social housing providers. We had a social housing provider last year built 88 properties. The main social housing provider in this borough built 88 new homes that we're looking for 700 people in temporary accommodation. So if the social rented sector is only building 88 homes a year, we're never going to get them into social housing. We're never going to get them into affordable housing. And we know the private sector hasn't got enough supply, and we know the rents in the private sector are too high. Our other major concern is the cultural shift, because every decision those 12 trainees make is going to be legally challenged. And they will be legally challenged by the gentleman we had here this evening, because he set up a charity that legally challenges this council, and this council has had to pay out a lot of compensation for decisions that were made previously that were not lawful. So you cannot create a corporate targeted culture when somebody is making a legal decision.
That is the first time I'm aware of that a councillor or any council bod has basically acknowledged that what they were doing was unlawful. So all throughout the period he's talking about, it wasn't just me, but it was John Allen and Shannon and Katie worked for us as well, but at Just Us. But during that period, their whole stance was, how dare you challenge us? We don't break the law. So it's nice to hear a councillor who was around in those times actually saying it publicly. Saying it all would be nice, but saying it publicly is probably a useful thing to to kind of just recognise, because at the time it was just a bit crazy, really.
You name me one solicitor, one barrister that has corporate targets. They don't. They follow the law. Their quality is based on the law. Their quality is based on case law. It's not based on a target given to them by a corporate body because they want to save money. If it's costing us too much money, then we need to be lobbying the government and saying, give us more money. Because the factors that create this problem of TA is high interest rates, high rents, lack of supply of housing, and they're all things that this borough has built its housing for the last 14 years, yet we've still got one of the highest TA accommodations in the country. But we've always met our housing targets given to us by the government. So if we meet our housing targets given to us by the government, and we've still got the highest rate of TA, something is going wrong with the housing supply market. And that's where joining up in partnership with planning, housing supply, because it is a separate department to operations, comes into play, because we need to build homes that people need, not what developers need. And that's the problem with the planning system, which creates more people wanting TA. Now, even if you start work and you earn the minimum wage, you still can't afford private rented sector accommodation in this area. Because most of your salary will go on, you'll be paying 50, 60 or 70% of your minimum wage on rent. And that is unsustainable. So a lot of the factors that are causing these are external. We'd like clarity about what the council policy moving forward is going to be. We would like to protect the most vulnerable still. And we don't want to see an increase in rough sleeping numbers in this borough. And I think we need to take those things into account as we move that forward. But I do think our officers are on the same page in that they're going to protect those residents in the borough that we have a legal duty to at the moment. But I can't see how any recommendations from this report is going to reduce our TA numbers, unfortunately. It's just badly written. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crofts. Has anyone else got any comments? Yes, Councillor Weir.
Can I just give a little shout out to Councillor Headley, who sat next to the Councillor Dean Crofts there, who's also spoke up in previous housing committee meetings for homeless people, should we say. I can't quite lip read what you said at the end then, but I feel like it was go on or well done or something like that. And he was nodding the whole way through. And they're part of the same political party as well, aren't they? For that sort of context. But yeah,
Yeah, they're both Lib Dems who are like essentially driving what they're talking about here in terms of the everyone in like extension and kind of getting rough sleeper numbers down and that sort of stuff. I mean, yeah. So again, Bedford's an outlier. I think Bedford's is built more houses than any other like area in the east of England. So we've got massive developments going up, and as he says, TA numbers are still sky high.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just for clarification, Councillor Croft started his comments with, "We are not happy with this report." I'm just trying to ensure that, are you speaking as a committee member of this committee, that we as a committee are not happy with it, or as a party political statement?
No, I can't speak for the committee. We as a group, and I'm here obviously as a Liberal Democrat, been invited onto the committee. We've looked at the report and we're not happy with the way the report is written. It's only a consultancy report, it's not council policy, and it hasn't been to the executive yet, but we would just make our feelings known that we as a group are not happy with the way and what is said in the consultancy report. I can't speak on behalf of other members of the committee, absolutely not.
Councillor Lane.
I'd just like to correct Councillor Crofts actually, because I think you can speak for other members of the committee as well, because I think we have concerns about aspects of the report. I think predominantly it's the mismatch between what Anna, you obviously are working to achieve, and perhaps some of the messaging from the report, they don't necessarily seem to align, and there is room in the report for it to be interpreted as meaning one thing that it is quite clear you've said you wouldn't enact, but I think we would be concerned that that's putting a lot of pressure on officers to interpret things or to be put in the firing line. So yes, we would be concerned that if this report were enacted, it wouldn't be something that we would support at all. There are aspects of it that are great, but it does need, I think we would need to be convinced that it is turned into something that works for you, for residents, and that we can get behind.
I think it's interesting as well, you know, because Councillor Weir essentially questioned Dean Croft, sort of, who are you talking for, or who are you talking on behalf of, which is a bit of a power move, let's, be honest. I do wonder, like, if these questions hadn't have been asked, and if you hadn't started off the meeting asking your question, would, other councillors have jumped in, like Councillor Lane here, and saying, actually, we disagree as well, and sort of that knock-on effect. And I just want to, and basically, I'm being clumsy, but I'm trying to highlight, I guess, the power that asking questions and housing committee has, because it has this knock-on effect of, if a member of public has brought it into the room, then you've just given Councillor Lane, Councillor Cross, Councillor Headley, Councillor Akhtar all reasons to say, yeah, no, we disagree as well, or whatever it might be. Whereas if you hadn't have kick-started, by your question, then potentially none of the others would have sort of joined in, I guess.
Yeah, go back to what we said last time. So asking that question, it was only like an hour or so before the meeting started because we had such little notice. But clearly, like, people have been talking about it, and I would imagine that led to people just kind of reading the report in more detail, because it was 90 pages long or something. You're probably not going to read much of it unless you've got a reason to. So yeah, no, I mean, I guess that's why we're doing the video in one sense. It's just about the value of asking questions to housing committees and kind of the sorts of dynamics that are going on within them. But yeah, and I agree. I think Councillor Weir was essentially trying to say Tories are happy with it, what, you shut up, basically. And I think actually that hasn't worked here because they don't have a majority.
Councillor Rigby.
Thank you. This has been a really good debate, and I compliment all sides on this one. I'd like to compliment the authors and the thoroughness and the honesty of this report. Homelessness is a failure of society. The key to control homelessness, in my opinion, is to try and identify potentially homeless people as soon as possible. This is one of the things that adults we're trying to do, is get in as quickly as we possibly can. And obviously we want to try and identify more potential houses to bring on stream. I know that's hard, but I believe it is possible to do that. And I think finally what I'd like to say is that I would like to sincerely thank all of our housing team for the diligence and the dedication that they've put into this. I know I can see from Anna's the passion she has, for which I know all of you have as well, and I certainly want to thank you very much for everything you're doing.
So obviously, I didn't edit this bit out. What a waste of space that comment is. I mean, clearly, he said. I'll pick up on a couple of things. What I'm going to say. He said the report from Anna Whalen and Andy Gale is honest. I would say that a number of comments we've seen throughout this, in terms of comments from Councillor Crofts and Councillor Lane, has basically said, clearly there's a bit of a code going on here. There's clearly other intentions going on here, so that's not honest. And I think the whole thing of all of the housing officers are great. Some of the housing officers are great. Some of the housing officers are absolutely just, they're nightmares. They're horrible people, and they do a lot of horrible things. And this, I think Councillor Rigby's have been a councillor for decades. So, luckily the committee is not filled with people like him. It's, but this is his only contribution to the whole thing. I don't think he said anything else the whole discussion. So I don't know what use is. I don't know. But yeah,
I would like
any final.
I'd just like to add, Mike and Shannon, I'd like to say how very, very grateful I am to you both for flagging that up, because homelessness is so important, and your efforts, and I know how passionate you are about it, and I can go on like this for a couple of minutes, but if you and it's all about prevention, when clearly what we've heard is it's there ain't enough houses. So catch them young. Let's catch them in the primary schools, and then we won't need to house them 20 years later.
The problem with comments like this is, look, I'm going to be completely honest, it makes me want to be really petty, because he's used the housing options officers are really dedicated. All right, perfect. Let's see the phone records of how many times it takes a client to ring before the housing options officer gets back. Let's see how many emails client has to email before the housing options officer gets back. Let's see how many complaints have been made about housing options officers, upheld or not.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. So, as I say, the point of doing this, or point of doing a commentary on these videos, is we're just hoping that people around the country will start asking questions in their local committee. If you go on the local government ombudsman website, it actually gives you suggested questions. I only saw it the other day, but it kind of gives you suggested questions of what you can ask council, just kind of generic ones that kind of get them talking. And as we saw in this one here, this was all based on the work we've been doing over 10 years, which kind of built up, and we kind of learned as we go along. And it was because we kind of knew, we saw the alarm bells with this report and kind of what it really meant, and raised it in this way that kind of, I'm hoping, has led to some of those recommendations being kind of ignored. So we, as I say, me and Shannon were at the committee a couple of weeks ago, so we'll probably do one on that as well, because there's again some interesting stuff there. I'm not listening to all of it yet, but there's a lot of things happening in Bedford which is going to affect a lot of people. So it's worth.
Yeah. Perhaps you don't know the answer to this question, but how widespread is the availability of these sorts of videos of committees? Because I'd never come across this before we did this, and if I took the trouble to actually look on my local council, do you think they might have? Is it a requirement nowadays that people put these things on?
There's no legal requirement to do so, as far as I understand. Basically, with COVID, they kind of embraced the technology to do it, and Bedford continues to do it. So Bedford in one sense is great, because you can go back and you can look at all of their committees for the last few years. So, and I know some other councils do it. Handful of parish councils did it, but I think there will be other. I think it might be a bit of a lottery, but it's all on the council's website. So if you look at, certainly it is for Bedford, if you go into the committee section, you've got the agenda and stuff, then there's the actual link to the video. So worth checking that.
What was that council that went viral with the
as Hanford, Hanford Parish, I saw. Check out the guy who got really irate in that meeting. He did another video defending himself, and it just went even worse. It was brilliant.
Have you seen all the memes of that, like the heavy metal version of it, and the
So apparently they were actually legally right, but how they obviously conducted themselves didn't do any favours.